It took a long time and effort for African Americans to get where they are today. Throughout history, African Americans have been discriminated, mistreated, and denied their rights. Through many trials and tribulations, African Americans have worked to earn their rights. World War II overall was one of the most influential events that helped sprout the growth on the perspective towards African Americans. With the initiation of World War I in 1917, African Americans were enthusiastic to contribute and show their patriotism, hoping to be finally recognized as full citizens.
In World War I, more than 20,000 African Americans enlisted in the military. Numbers continued to increase in May 1917 when Selective Service Act was enacted.
July 5, 1917, over 700,000 African Americans had registered for military service. However, were banned from the Marines and served only in menial roles.
Years later, when World War II was beginning, there was a drastic change. Over 2.5 million African American men registered the draft. Not only men, but African American women volunteered in large growing numbers. African Americans served their country in a distant way. Over time, more opportunities were given to African Americans and their roles began to advance. They were given the opportunity to work in the Army, Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guards. However, they continued to suffer from discrimination and segregation, regardless of their involvement in the war.
During the war, the GI Bill was a bill signed into law by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, went into effect in 1994. It was created to help veterans of World War II, providing them with a variety of benefits. Successfully establishing hospitals, providing loan-effect mortgages, loans covering tuition and expenses covering education for veterans. Nearly 9 million veterans received close to $4 billion from the bill's unemployment compensation program from 1944 to 1949, and benefits continue to extend over time, including a larger group of veterans. The GI Bill extended benefits for all veterans, regardless of gender or race. However, African Americans and women found it harder to thrive off these benefits. African Americans continued to be treated as less than whites. They were denied housing in suburb areas, limited with college tuition money and school choice. The local banks refused to loan money to African Americans.
The Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the southern states. These laws were meant to mistreat African Americans by denying them the right to vote, hold jobs, or get an education. These laws started late 1870s when laws required separations from white people and people of color. The people who didn't follow these laws often faced arrest, fines, jail sentences, violence, and death. The post-World War II era saw an increase in civil rights activities in the African American community, which ensured the civil rights movement that resulted in the removal of the Jim Crow laws. In 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which legally ended the segregation that had been established in the Jim Crow laws.
African Americans served in the war doing many jobs like medics, airmen, and officers, which allowed many to get recognized.
December 1941, he distinguished himself during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. He was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions.
Doris Miller was a hero who was ordered to a bridge to aid wounded commanded officers while firing at planes until his ammo ran out. Another was Waverly Woodson Jr., who was a young medic that was nominated for a Medal of Honor for saving scores of drowning and wounded men. Philip Randolph was one of the many to protest discrimination. He met with the president and got him to sign Executive Order 8802 that banned discrimination in defense industries.
The military experience afforded thousands of African Americans and triggered a lot from the South in search of better opportunities. African Americans used the opportunity to fight against racism with a segregated army. That resulted in Roosevelt issuing Executive Order 8802, which banned discrimination in government and defense industry employment.
Many African American veterans during the World War II, when returned home, still continued with their struggle for equality, but the ones that definitely made for future change.
As a result from the war, civil rights leader and labor activist Philip Randolph had an encounter with President D. Roosevelt. By 1943, African American employment has improved, including getting higher skill positions and earning a higher pay. Despite all the denial, African Americans built political action through the use of black press.
Since the military discarded some of its racist practices, this led to opportunities they've never reached before. This, all in all, led to new beginnings. In 1941, African Americans were admitted for the first time to the Army Air Corps, which resulted to the highly publicized training of hardy African American aviators. A year later, Marine Corps admitted its first blacks. The first Marine officer was commissioned in November 1945. 1942, the Navy began accepting blacks for general services positions. Later on, the Navy undertook a limited experience in having all-black crews. They also generally gained free access to theaters, exchanges, and recreational facilities on military bases. Overall, World War II led to many struggles in African American lives. It took time to get to where they were at when they were finally getting recognized. In World War II, this led not only to the first, but to where they are today. The end.
Bloopers.
They were given the opportunity and signed the Civil Rights Act, which legally
However, were banned from the Marines and served only in menial roles.
With the initiation, World War II overall was one of the most World War II